Good evening. I'm going to need to start with several important points of clarification. First of all, I was not informed before accepting this distinctive responsibility that Ronald Reagan had occupied this position on the stage at any point. And I have a very explicit rule that I send out in all my contracts for speaking engagements: never follow Ronald Reagan. But I will break it here tonight. The second point of clarification, Rob mentioned that I, very kindly stooped to enter his humble Texan home for what I think in his description he's suggesting it was, three guys sitting around a barbecue in the backyard listening to me counsel them to have more children. In fact, I would describe the Hayes home in Dallas as only slightly larger than this space in terms of its capacity. So I just want people to be clear about that. A final point of clarification is that while I do not have 7 kids, I do now have 5, which brings me up, I think, to slightly below average for the population of this room. Finally, I did want to say something personal about the interesting position that I occupy as, let's say, the Ethics and Public Policy Center's donor base's favorite New York Times columnist. I get that a lot. Sometimes people will say, what's it like? How do you do it being a pro-life newspaper columnist, a religious conservative, writing for secular liberals? And I'm glad to have all of you here tonight so that I can reveal that it was all a long con to get each and every one of you into this room. Parties of heavily armed Berkeley graduate students are currently sealing the exits, and you may not make it out of here. So anyway, no, it is a tremendous privilege to be with all of you tonight. It's a tremendous privilege to be here to celebrate 50 years of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And I'm going to try to say something laudatory about the work that EPPC does and its achievements over the last 5 decades, and then something forward-looking, a minor exercise in punditry about the challenges that Ryan Anderson, all by himself, shirtless and armed, will have to fend off or face off against in the years to come. So let's start 50 years ago, because I think in the middle of the 1970s, it was very easy to imagine a future in which American politics was dominated, much like the politics of Western Europe has often been, by a kind of absolutist, socially liberal and secular consensus. One that marginalized religious arguments, that traded in a religious humanism for a kind of utilitarianism, and that really abandoned any kind of strong defense of an innate human dignity. And I think the great work of EPPC has been to stand athwart that particular future and also to propose and defend a different one, a different vision. To defend when necessary, let's say, but also to counterattack whenever possible. And like all movements, the cause of an ecumenical religious conservatism, a Judeo-Christian humanism, has known both victories and setbacks. No one would look around the United States of America in 2026 and say that religious conservatism stands triumphant and all its enemies have fallen. But I think that you can measure EPPC's impact and its power and its influence and the influence of the movement and causes it has served across multiple dimensions in ways that I think would have been truly unexpected. Again, starting from where the culture was and has been at various points in its history. That includes long sought and often impossible seeming victories, like the end of Roe v. Wade above all. It means lines held and possibilities and dystopias resisted on issues like assisted suicide and euthanasia. It involves ground regained, as in recent debates on transgender issues, sports, gender transitions, whether Ryan Anderson's book should be available on the internet. And it means especially integrity and consistency on key issues amid ideological realignments and partisan pressure. I think to have come through the last 10 years in particular with both your original commitments and your principles fully intact is a very important achievement that we should all be grateful for. Not that anything weird has happened in the last 10 years. It's been totally fine and normal. Above all, though, I think you can measure EPPC's success in just the fact that religious conservatism remains a confident and dynamic force in American life, even as, yes, a minority perspective in some ways, because you can contrast that with where I think its great adversary, secular liberalism, has ended up, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. I feel like in that period, social and cultural liberalism has fallen into a profound internal crisis that's shadowed increasingly by various forms of pessimism and despair. And if no one looking around the United States today would say that social conservatism stands triumphant, I don't think anyone looking around the US or Western Europe would say that a secular, hyper-individualist, utilitarian ethos actually has the winds of history at its back, or that it's poised to govern the rest of the 21st century, that it's ready to master technological change, or suppress radicalism and nihilism, or even, to return to the subject of my lecture in Dallas, that it's capable of inspiring human beings to the most basic task of reproduction, of having kids. No. Great battles are won not just by defeating your opponents, but sometimes by simply outlasting them. And in 2026, I would confidently bet on the worldview described in that video, the worldview embodied and celebrated here tonight, outlasting the increasingly exhausted rival with which it has been wrestling for, lo, these many decades. However, hold the applause, because the exhaustion of secular liberalism does not mean that all the world stands ready to embrace Judeo-Christian humanism or adhere firmly to Ryan Anderson thought. If the last 50 years were defined by, most of the time, a pretty stark conflict between a religious humanist vision and a secular liberal alternative, I think that the next few decades are likely to be, well, let's borrow a term from foreign affairs and describe them as multipolar. And institutions like EPPC need to be ready for that world and ready for a new set of challenges and challengers. And I'll sketch out sort of brief descriptions of what I see as sort of the main 3 categories that exist as potent or potentially potent alternatives to religious humanism right now. The first is probably the most familiar one, an illiberal left, a progressivism defined not by its commitment to an aggressive individualist liberalism, but by a kind of rejection of anything that seems too liberal and centrist and procedural and technocratic. This is wokeness, right? And all its pomps and works. In some areas and places and situations, it's in a kind of hibernation right now, but I think that it is likely to be poised for a comeback and is certainly resilient in many American institutions. It's not relativistic and utilitarian like secular liberalism often is, but it is moralistic, ideological, sometimes fanatical, filled with a kind of quasi-religious energy, even as it lacks often truly religious hope. So that's one force, one category. The second one is, let's call it, a post-Christian right. The return of Friedrich Nietzsche, maybe in the form of, various internet personalities whose importance could hopefully be exaggerated, but I think manifest in a wider scale than that. There's a lot of talk and critique and anxiety, especially among my friends who are liberal or on the left, about an age of Christian nationalism. I think that the danger for Christians, for people of sincere religious faith, is a future where there's a Christian nationalism that is primarily about nationalism and only incidentally about Christianity, where religion is purely subordinate to secular political causes, or simply a nationalism without Christianity entirely. that doesn't even bother to wear religion as a veneer, that's focused entirely on ethnic and tribal loyalties, and that brings, quite predictably, anti-Semitism and racism in its train. It's always been the case that there are forces like that at work on the political right. This is not entirely a novelty, but I think in the larger crisis of the secular liberal order, those kind of forces obviously have new life, and they're part of discourse and argument and debate on the political right in a way that I've never seen in my own lifetime. And engagement with, argument with, and confrontation with those ideas and arguments and forces, I think, is fundamentally essential. So I've given you a perspective from the right and a perspective from the left. And then let's call this last one a transhumanist center, meaning, in particular, a big part of the world of Silicon Valley, which has its influence on both the right and the left, can ally with Republicans and with Democrats, can appear progressive and can appear right-wing, all in the service of a vision that can present itself as non-ideological, but really embeds all kinds of Promethean, if we're being optimistic, or sometimes even Luciferian, if we're being extremely pessimistic, assumptions about what human beings ought to be and what we might become, offering technologies that I don't think can simply be rejected or moralized away, but that desperately need to be moralized seriously about and mastered before they master us. And I think it is especially essential for the people involved in the kind of work that EPPC does to take all of these rivals, all of these alternatives very seriously, not just defaulting to a right-left binary, as important as that may be, in which wokeness is always seen as the primary enemy, but reckoning with forces that are in the political center, are in the political establishment, are inside the right-wing coalition, reckoning with the racist podcaster or the eugenicist transhumanist as much as the pro-choice Democratic Party leader or the, left-wing academic. But finally, I want to stress, on an optimistic note, the importance of seeing the opportunity here in this unusual multipolar landscape, recognizing that there is not some sort of aggressive, ascendant, monolithic alternative to the vision that religious conservatives want to put forward. Rather, there is a fractured group of rivals. And in this landscape, there's absolutely no reason to think that religious humanism can't contend equally for influence. There's no need to regard social and cultural conservatism as a remnant, or even just as a creative minority, a language that I've sometimes used myself. I won't use the term moral majority because that's a little historically fraught. But I do think that aspiration is the correct one for the people who work at EPPC, the people who support EPPC, the people in this room tonight, to see a moment of crisis and fracture and derangement as also a moment ripe for argument, persuasion, conversion, revival, to help large numbers of Americans who are sort of adrift between alternative visions of the good life and the future, who are prone to succumb to either despair or, again, sort of an over-reliance on various utopianisms, to offer to them the message that EPPC has always offered, right? A message that emphasizes the truth about the human person and the essential idea, what I think is going to be the essential 21st century idea, that there is no cause greater than ensuring in this strange digital, technological, and political future the full flourishing, the ultimate survival, and the final triumph of, God bless us all, the human race. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.